Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to another in our November lecture series in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. My name is Chuck Smythe, and I'm the Director of the Culture and History Department here at Sealaska Heritage Institute. And I invite you to pick up a schedule of our lectures. We've got lectures every week, sometimes twice a week for the month. They're on the table outside. Also, may I remind you to please put your cell phones on mute, because we're recording this, and this lecture will appear on our Vimeo site shortly after it's completed. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Steve Langdon, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, where he taught from 1976 to 2014. He developed foundational courses there. And also was a highly valued mentor for students, graduate students and undergraduates. And in recognition of that, and also his research throughout the state, primarily in Southeast, he received the Bullock Prize from the University of Alaska Foundation for career excellence and contributions to Alaska. He's conducted research projects on many public policy issues impacting Alaska Natives, including the detrimental impacts of limited entry and the positive impacts of the community development quota system. Recently, he conducted a research project for us on Alaska Native eligibility to hunt marine mammals. He's also conducted extensive research on traditional ecological knowledge of salmon fishing in Southeast Alaska by the Tlingit and Haida, and he made substantial contributions to our exhibit downstairs in the Halibut and Salmon Interactives. I encourage you to go see those, and you can see much of that came as a result of Steve's extensive knowledge and experience in that area. His book, The Native People of Alaska, is a widely used introduction to Alaska Native people. And also, I'd like to mention that last year he received the Denali Prize from the Alaska Federation of Natives. So Steve will be speaking on Klawock, the first cannery in Alaska, and the path not taken. The presentation will describe the Klawock Tlingit technical, social, and spiritual relationship with salmon and the events at Klawock at the beginning of the commercial salmon period. The Ganakati clan leader asserted his ownership and control of the Klawock River and established that principle as the foundation of the relationship that allowed the emergence of commercial salmon canning in the state. The story of the Klawock Tlingit model of how to maintain indigenous control over the use of their salmon and develop a workable relationship with the white industrial entrepreneurs includes incidents of confrontation and engagement with governmental actors to secure and maintain control. The events at Klawock reveal a powerful story about a path not taken elsewhere in the state, where indigenous peoples with long-standing and well-established trusty relationships with salmon were pushed aside and the resources expropriated. So with that, I'd like to introduce Steve. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Rosita Worrell for the opportunity and the invitation to bring this topic up. Topic very near and dear to my heart after over 40 years of working in this area. Thanks to Chuck Smythe for the very kind introduction. And I'd also like to acknowledge some dear friends of mine from the Klawock area. Deborah Head. Deborah? She stepped to the it's one of those kind of moments, I guess, you know. And the images that some of that you'll see in here, I'd also like to thank Jim Samard from the Alaska Historical Library, who was quite helpful in many respects in my research over the years. So, in the histories of Alaska and its commercial salmon industry, a short statement typically appears as follows. probably in your high school history books. The first salmon cannery in Alaska opened in 1878 at Klawock. End of story. There's never a second sentence about Klawock, not even one that stipulates that this was occurred in a Tlingit community, nor that that community had deep and rich heritage associated with salmon of that place, as all Tlingit people do in their places. But there is a fascinating story to be told about Klawock that informs us both about the rich and deep heritage of their relationship with salmon and how those events at the beginning of the commercial salmon period constitute a remarkable occasion of indigenous agency at the time of industrial emergence of a commercial salmon industry. This agency was able to produce for over 25 years both sustained yields and wealth and livelihoods for the indigenous residents of the community and nearby communities. The story of the Klawock Tlingit model of how to maintain indigenous control over the use of their salmon and develop a workable relationship with the white entrepreneurs is indeed a story of a path not taken. Here I am, and I'd like to acknowledge my mentors and my clan parents. In this case, what on the left is Alicia Fields Roberts, who is the Ganachudi matriarch of the Mink House when I arrived in Klawock over 40 years ago. And she taught me a great deal, and she was married to Theodore Roberts, who's of the Shunkwedi Wolf clan, and together they taught me an enormous amount of information about the area and its history. And I want to honor both of them in this particular discussion today. So here today we see the location of Klawock on Prince of Wales Island in the southwest central area. This is obviously a significant place that we're going to be talking about. This is the contemporary way in which, courtesy of SHI, the Hina Kwan is depicted in the maps of the Tlingit people, in the Kwan maps. But originally there was a second location as well. The Klawock Kwan were a distinct settlement, distinct from the others. And George Emmons, in his manuscript unpublished on the Tlingit clans and tribes, wrote of the Klawock Kwan, as they're termed, this tribe has never been given its proper place amongst the Tlingit families, but has been included in the Hina Kwan. It is a very old division, possibly older than the latter people, and included the inhabitants of Port Bucareli, who were described by Morel, who accompanied the Spanish expedition in 1779. This region seems to be a center of life in the early days, but the population decreased until during our occupation this tribe has become almost extinct. Smallpox ravaged this location several times, and whole villages were practically wiped out and deserted. As I have over the years worked with documents and oral traditions, I have been able to piece together what I think is an approximate distribution of the clans, approximately at 1860, before the last major population distribution. A couple of important clans that be referenced are the two clans are side by side, which is a commonplace in Tlingit life of clans intermarrying between the Ganachudi that you saw before and the Shunkwedi. So within the Ganachudi boundaries are Klawock Lake, which you can see here, as well as other territory. I took the initiative at one point in time to have Alicia and Theodore sit down with a chart, and in that chart I had them put their hands on their traditional territories. And so, as you can see, Theodore thinks he's got two hands worth of territory when in fact he doesn't. Theodore places his hands on their traditional tension. He was a little expansive in his claim, as was his wont, while Alicia is considerably understated, as was her wont with regard to the traditional clan territories. But the two clans lay side by side and were, at the time of contact, the intermarrying most significant two clans at Klawock. This table shows a number of archaeological sites that have been found in the region. It dates back to nearly 6,000 years ago. There's also the ancient village location, the location of where the saltery and the cannery were. And all of those in the blue there are all of the intertidal fish traps that were used and created and are part of the exhibit that's down below that you will see. So the archaeological evidence indicates that the first settlement occurred here at this particular location by the modern hatchery, if anybody's ever been in that area. There's an archaeological site dated there to about 6,000 years old. Unfortunately, it got destroyed by the hatchery makers before it was able to be discovered. In the 1990s, we did some archaeological research on the village. The ancient village was occupied on both sides at the estuary and just above the falls by the two clans. And in the original origin account given by John Darrow, who I'll mention, when the clans moved into this region, on the north side were the Tka Hate and on the south side the Tka Hate. And we'll see that later on. That village site, we got an archaeological date at about 1,000 years old, but I suspect that's could be older than that. Then, in addition, all in the intertidal zone there, you see all of those numbers are associated with the extensive intertidal fish traps that exist in that area. Finally, here is the location where the village was built. The cannery was built, and it had a Tlingit name for the small little island that was called Walk Around Island in Tlingit, which was originally where Tka Hate allowed the community to, the cannery to take up occupation. This is John Darrow, also named Atsaguni Ish, and his other names go back to the very first time of encounter. He gave an extensive oral tradition to the origins of Klawock and of the Tka Hate and Tka Hate. And in his account, the story tells that the man named Klawock, who was Tka Hate, originally came across and found the location, and his both Tka Hate and his Tka Hate relatives followed him and established the community. And at that time, they settled on both sides of the river. Following a dispute, the Tka Hates left the country and went further south. And at the time when the Tka Hates took over, it was a man named Tka Hate who became the clan leader of the Tka Hates. So the Tka Hates, in honor of the location, named it Klawock after the discovery. So that's how the name came to be in that location. Another individual who worked with John Darrow on the tradition of the Klawock people was, just briefly, this is an interesting photo because you can see that John Darrow had become a Salvation Army man later on in his life. His wife, Ida Darrow, is of Kagwantan, and that will come up again. There's a very interesting and deep story that wasn't part of the Kagwantan story last week, but it's part of it here too. But at any rate, another scholar, Tlingit scholar, who worked with John Darrow in 1916 was Louis Shotridge, and one of the Shotridge's very wonderful documents that he created are genealogical charts for many communities, where he took down the people's names and their clans and their houses. And this is one of the cards that he got from talking to John Darrow. And in that card you can see the mother here is a Tka Hate, and her son is called Tka Hate the First. And that was from a particular house. It doesn't reference the original. So these then are the ancestral lineage of the Tka Hate leading to Tka Hate, who at the time of contact was the important person. Now, another very significant part of Tlingit heritage discussed now, you can see is the salmon boy. Salmon are the iconic relationship for Tlingit people. Many clan crests are with salmon. The salmon boy story, which is the foundation that elders told me is how they learned about salmon. And through that story, they learn of a young boy who went down and lived with the salmon people, where he learned that they were people like us, and where he was taught by the salmon chief about how they must be treated and respected so that they could return to their streams and give themselves to the people. So he lived there with the salmon people for several years, and then they returned. The salmon chief told him, get in the canoes, and returned. And he came back to shore, and he approached his parents' camp, and his parents captured him, and they saw that he was wearing a necklace, the same necklace as their son that they had lost several years before had been wearing. So they said, what should we do? They put the salmon up, and the next day he was transformed back into a human being, and he then told all of the information about that he had learned from salmon. So this is the icon, especially about how they must be respected, how must they be respected, and how they're, in order for them to return, their bones had to be put back into the water. So this salmon boy story is an iconic foundation from Yakutat down to Saxman in terms of the understanding. There's another important story that I won't talk about, is the Fog Woman story, is another important story in this line. So in these particular two ways in which the intersections of art and mythic charters and covenants occurs in Tlingit culture, one of its most extraordinary expressions of living in existence, is in this object over here, which now has been utilized as the motif, if you would, for the exhibit downstairs, which has been recaptured, and it put the colors on it. And this, as you can see, clearly depicts a boy in the salmon. This stands for the salmon boy story. The amazing thing about this, which is another exemplar of the ways in which Tlingit look to that story as a foundation in terms of how do you elaborate ways to respect salmon, is that this particular stake was on a fish trap outside Wrangell, where it stuck up above the water. And in the salmon boy story, what happens is when he's coming back as a salmon, the chief tells him to stand up to see where they're at. But because he's a salmon at that time, standing up, he jumps out of the water. And across southeastern Alaska, that's the first sign of affirmation and respect, is when a Tlingit sees the salmon jumping out of the water, what does he say, Rosita? Ayo. Ayo. Hey yo. Every Tlingit says that. That is the first sign of affirmation and respect that comes from the salmon boy. So as they approach the stream, who's jumping out of the water? The salmon are jumping out of the water. And what are they going to see when they jump out of the water? They're going to see that stake. And that's the ways in which you take the template of respect and you expand it and you deepen it and you make it a full and complete way of life. Another way in which the Tlingit of the Hinya Kwan showed this respect is in this particular house painting, which was on the Hinya village of Tuxacan, and it's associated with the Tlingit, the dog salmon raven people. Any dog salmon raven clan people here today? This particular is an extraordinary crest that still comes down in use on raven dog salmon people's objects to this day. Story behind this is in the telling of the Tlingit version of the Salmon Boy story. When Salmon Boy returned back to the community and became transformed back into a man, he recalled the house front on the salmon leader's house in the village that he came from. And he put that same painting on his house. So this house front painting is tied to the Salmon Boy story and those experiences. All of these constitute the kinds of ramifications. There were also first salmon ceremonies conducted amongst the Hinya and the Klawock in which the salmon are going out and as they arrive received. There's a salmon feast, and in Klawock the leader put the bones back in the river, and Alicia and others talked about that first salmon feast. So all of this points to the fundamental spiritual foundations that we find amongst the Klawock in terms of their relationship to salmon. Here then now we're seeing an aerial photograph taking us back to 1926, a long time ago, and depicts the various different parts of the intertide. What I want to point out to you right now is in the upper portion are these quite clear geometric forms, these semicircular arcs that you see here. Less evidentiary are these fingers that you see over here, these pointed areas, and both of those play a very significant part in terms of the story that we'll be telling here shortly. Those, in fact, are the evidence we have of the ancient fish trap structures that we find in this area. And this indeed, when I subjected this area to the totality of all of the area that is brought into construction by Tlingit engineers and scientists. David Katzik always likes me to emphasize this, but that's what it is. Engineers and scientists bringing these forms into existence. Over 38 acres over the centuries constructed in this particular area. That's what we'll be seeing here shortly now. And this is that area looking eastward, and this area on the right with all the semicircular forms is called Ganakarian Yaktat, which is an indication of the ownership of this territory by the Ganakari clan. So go ahead, Will, if you go ahead and click on and we'll see the clip.
This is the Klawock River estuary located on the west coast of Prince of Wales Island in southeastern Alaska.
In this area, Tlingit people devised two technologies for capturing 4 species of salmon. These salmon, which have been returning to this river for thousands of years, provided the Tlingit with their primary food throughout the winter season. These fishing methods are referred to as tidal pulse fishing because the ebb and flow action of the tide is critical to the capture of salmon. Salmon were returning to the river to spawn. At high tide, the traps were completely covered, allowing the salmon to enter the river unimpeded. When the tide receded, some of the salmon were caught as the traps were exposed, while other fish backed out with the tide. Using these methods, Tlingit fishermen trapped salmon in 2 different ways. In the estuary channel, they placed VTraps positioned so that the strong, outgoing tidal current held the salmon against the trap's walls. Nearby, they placed semicircular traps on the lagoon flats, specially designed to use the slower-moving water of the ebbing tide to trap salmon. Salmon entered the traps shortly after high tide as it started to go out, but could not leave once the tide retreated below the wooden walls, trapping them inside.
Immediately behind us is in the estuary zone. The system that was developed is called VTraps.
The Tlingit created VTraps by pounding alignments of carved wooden stakes into the stream substrate that were supported by rocks. Trap makers positioned the VTraps so that one of the arms followed the estuary channel and the other pointed toward the shore at a 45-degree angle. The wooden stakes in both arms would be 2 to 3 feet high. The stakes would be densely packed at the apex to avoid any salmon escaping the trap. The Tlingit designed this technology so the salmon backing out on the ebb tide would be channeled into the traps. Gradually the salmon would be pushed toward the apex, so at mid to low water as the tide receded, people would be able to capture the fish. Throughout this estuary, from the falls to the lower portion of the tidal zone, the Tlingit built a number of VTraps over a considerable period of time. One of the traps was built 875 years ago. Most of the V-pointed green islands seen here are the result of the Tlingit, who created this engineered landscape. The traps were outlawed by the U.S. government in 1889, and the Tlingit had to stop using them. Since that time, the abandoned traps have collected sediment coming down the river, creating the grassy islands where the V-traps were located. Tlingit fishermen used a second traditional technology, semicircular fish traps that allowed them to capture salmon on the ebb tide on tidal flats. The Tlingit would drive stakes in a semicircular arc in areas covered by the high tide. As the tide receded, salmon were caught behind the stakes or weir fences and harvested. Tlingit trap makers built these traps at different times and in different areas within the intertidal zone. The intertidal traps were an ingenious way to capture but never waste salmon that were not needed. At low tide, the fish could survive in the water remaining in the trap. At this point, they were collected for processing. Within a few hours, the high tide returned and fish that weren't captured could escape back into the estuary. This set of traps included a more sophisticated feature than other traps that have been located in this area. The Tlingit created a canal to connect the large semicircular trap with a pond which would hold salmon during the low tide. This innovation allowed the people to collect salmon while they were alive and fresh. Different households built traps for their own use. Over time, the Tlingit residents of this area created a very dramatic and sophisticated human-engineered landscape in the Klawock estuary.
Who noticed color differences in the fish? What was the color differences showing? In the VTraps, they were what color? Which would mean what? And in the circular traps, those were humpies. So the traps were designed based upon not only the geomorphic flow rates, different design for the flow rates of the water, but also for the characteristics of different kind of salmon. So it shows you again the sophistication of this knowledge is again, these are the Tlingit biologists as well as working with the engineers, I guess. When Emmons came throughout southeast Alaska, as the populations were struck by these diseases, certain areas were more heavily devastated, and the Klawock location was extremely devastated. Here's what Emmons wrote about Tka Hate. In 1888, that's when Emmons was by there, and I found these notes in one of his notebooks never before found in the Beinecke Library. All of the tribe numbering at this place 30 souls. So Tka Hate had 30 Ganahuttis, lived in several houses, surrounded by a high board stockade on the small island on which the cannery was built. The villages of the Haida and the Hina, who were employed here by the cannery, lived here during the summer, were directly across the narrow channel on the shore of the harbor. The Klawocks claiming the country resented the intrusion of outsiders, and the chief of the tribe acknowledged no authority of his new neighbors. Despite the devastation of the epidemics, Tka Hate had survived with a handful of his relatives, and his control and his strength as the leader asserted the traditional clan ownership. He was probably about 37 years old when the U.S. came in 1867. Now, in about 1868 or 69, the Scottish peddler George Hamlin came around, and Tka Hate agreed to allow him to set up a trading post, and then also afterward a salmon saltery. Hamilton agreed that Tka Hate, along with the designated helpers of his clansmen and others, would supply the salmon for the saltery, and he recognized his ownership of the stream, beginning the process of paying for the lease. This is the oldest picture that I believe exists that I've been able to find of Tka Hate. Again, this picture wasn't made public until about 8 to 10 years ago, when I found it in the John Brady collection. And John Brady, who was governor from 1896 to 1904, first came to Klawock in 1882. So I think that this picture may date from that particular time. It has his name on the back of it, also with the sardonic note that he's wearing a coachman's coat. He's probably wearing a coachman's coat because the cannery man gave it to him as a show of respect. in that particular, just like other Tlingit leaders wore what kind of garments? They wore naval garments. This would be another demonstration of that particular kind of success. These next three slides are of the sketch maps that I found in Emmons's 1888 notebook, and this is basically his access route, a way that those who've been in and who know these waters well can quickly pick up and see how he's passing through Shanda and then turning left to get up towards the Klawock Bay. Here's a little bit closer view in which he's showing where the Tka Village, as he referred to it, was located at that time. He also shows over here, for those with local knowledge, Canoe Pass is being demonstrated here, and also an important early graveyard point. The next slide is quite interesting as he pulls us into an even closer view, and he shows us where the cannery was located and the wharf where the fish tied up. This is a central location here, is this very narrow channel that enters from Klawock Bay into the lagoon, which we'll have reference to here shortly. Here as well we can see the Tka Village that he spoke of, and at this time the mission that the Presbyterians built in 1886 was also present. But I want to draw your attention up here. He didn't go up there, he called it an Indian hut. That means from where he was down here he could see it. That's Tka Hate's house. That's where he positioned himself to oversee what was going on. And as we'll hear later, it was not what should be referenced disrespectfully as a hut in my estimation. So this is a picture taken a little bit after 1900 by the missionaries David Wagner from the mission location, and he's looking up the estuary. And what we can see is in fact that the location of that house that had been previously pointed out by Emmons. What we can also see, if you direct your eyes, and you have to squint a little bit, are these kind of two upright lines right here as well that are existing right down from the house. And here's what that depicts. Here we can see in this particular image taken probably in the 1920s, we can see two poles along with that house in the background and another structure over here. And these two poles are related to the Ganachati and the Tka Hate. This particular pole on the right is a raven and mink, which is the primary crest of the Klawock Ganachati today. And on the left is the whale and raven pole that's associated with the drifted ashore. And that pole was considered to be one erected later in honor of Tka Hate. This is the first. This is a recarved version of the mink pole that is now associated with the carving shed there in Klawock. Many of you who passed through have seen that as well. Now this is an image, I would say, from the mid-1880s, perhaps a little bit earlier, from the geographer George Davidson. And on the left you can see all the construction associated with the cannery complex, including the sawmill. The sawmill, which is right here, which was very important in terms of providing the lumber for new construction. And on the right is the Haida village, and that was seasonally occupied by the Haidas who came up to work in the cannery. And that had been going on since Hamilton, who had connections with them as well. As I mentioned before, Tka Hate established a working relationship with these cannery operators. Part of the operation the new firm inherited was the relationship with Tka Hate as the owner of the stream, and the recognition of the ownership and rights to determine the salmon harvest. It is in this moment and the events that followed that we find the path not found. And as a footnote, it's a path that was attempted many times by Tlingit leaders throughout southeastern Alaska as well. Tka Hate, in this early period of the cannery operations, likely continued the traditional Tlingit practice of using those intertidal fish traps that we saw. And it wasn't until perhaps 18 to 20 years later that they were, when they were removed in the late 1880s. Interestingly, this document was found, and I'd like to thank Zach Taylor for finding this at the Alaska Historical Archives. This is one of the leases. In the southern part of southeastern Alaska, there are many lease documents, not many, there are a number of lease documents which specifically specify who the ownership of the Klawock River is, and indeed represents the signature, by the signature of the cannery owner, represents the recognition of that particular ownership. This document is registered in a federal record as a lease document. And it says, known by all men these presents that I, the undersigned, do hereby lease and rent the creek known as Klawock to the North Pacific Packing and Trading for the term of 10 years for the sum of $100 per annum. Said amount to be paid as follows, 50 in coin, 50 in goods. And at the bottom is the signature of Tka Hate, as well as the recorder. Here's a wonderful picture that comes from the Alaska State Historical Library, taken after about 1900. As you can see, Tka Hate presented himself in a very dignified manner in white style as he administered his leadership in the community. And this is taken by the village at that particular time period in terms of when he was still in the area. The next four slides show the Klawock area when Jefferson Moser came into the area in 1879. And here you can see a replication of the earlier George Davidson photo, showing again a much more expanded now cannery edifice, more construction in here associated with it, and newer construction, and now we can see that missionary house. This is looking from across the channel on the south to the north. This has been represented a few times, this period showing the cannery and the wharf. This is where vessels, amazingly, vessels would come in, whether they were sailing vessels or large steamers would come in, and they would be tied up at this wharf to take on the pack at the end of the season. Here's a picture from slightly to the northwest, and on the left what you can see is the buildings of the Tlingit village, which was constructed with the sawmill labor. And in this final vision, which is nowhere available, you'll see all of the village houses all along and right facing onto the cannery, as well as other parts of the island occupied, including some traditional housing with smokehouses at this particular time. So on the operations at Klawock, the census enumerator in 1890, Porter said, this cannery is carried out almost entirely by native labor. Makes one of the most interesting institutions of its kind, for in all other canneries the work is done by Chinese. Some of you may recall the incident in Sitka, which was undertaken in 1880 by the chief in Sitka to keep the Chinese from taking over in that location, and successful for a period. Moser also pointed out that the canneries recognized well-established Indian rights to salmon streams by paying the chiefs a certain amount. In many cases, in both of the locations, Porter said, both commentators, the product of this cannery enters into successful competition with all others and finds ready sale. And Moser said that the pack made from here is second to none. The work at Klawock, from taking the fish to the loading of the cases containing the canned product, is nearly all done by Indians, from women and children. Later on, during the time period, Tka Hate most likely was also a person to present periodically demands for improved wages. And those demands were associated with the proposition, if they were not seated, that the people would strike. And so we can see the Tlingits have their own labor union motivation for dealing with these particular circumstances. In 1882, there was a confrontation at Klawock. What precisely was the basis of that confrontation is not known. But in the U.S. records, Lieutenant Burwell from the Navy and Brady came down, and they met with the parties to find a solution. Burwell reported that several chiefs asked for papers, and as a naval, he recognized them through paper transmissions. The governments do not state what the dispute concerned. However, there is an oral tradition that likely relates to this particular incident. A physical object is associated with the tradition that has the resonance of the Tlingit concept and practice of At'u. And this is the object that you see on the right. This is the object. Theodore Roberts holds the monument that oral tradition, he learned, states was placed by he called them army personnel, in a location just above the upper tide line below the cannery. That location was to mark the separation of waters where Tlingit fisheries controlled by Tka Hate were conducted from those conducted by the cannery fishermen. Furthermore, Theodore went on to state that in addition, the agreement included the provision that the Tka Hate's fishermen would receive 10 cents for those that he delivered, taken from above the marker. Here is Alicia, Theodore, her clan sister, and her great-granddaughter at the location in which they gave that oral tradition with regard to that mark. Now, I don't know if that's what happened in 1882. This oral tradition is what contends that did happen, and indeed it went on from that particular time period. Under Tka Hate's trusteeship, the Klawock River continued to produce substantial amounts of sockeye salmon. Over this time period, there was a relative average of about 45 sockeyes taken per year. There's probably not been 45 sockeyes returned there in the last 4 years in current times, unfortunately. It's been a very difficult time, but this is the evidence, I would say, of what Tlingit trusteeship can bring about. And it is precise in this circumstance that we see the evidence of Tka Hate's Tlingit leadership and his responsibility to his community is that he held this incredible potlatch. And this is what really drew to my extent, pulled these things all together. The magnet for me in terms of Tka Hate's accomplishment was through this description of this potlatch that he held in 1890. So this census enumerator Porter came to the island in 1890 to count the folks. And he circumnavigated the island, finding that all the people around the island were aware of this July 4th potlatch that he had invited them to. And here's how Porter described the events that took place at Tka Hate's house on the third day of the 4-day ceremony. When they were all in the room of the chief's house, it was filled to suffocation, and peering into the doors and windows were the faces of many others anxious to witness the ceremonies. There must have been over 400 native presents. How do you get 400 people in a hut? Okay, it's a very large and a very large communal house, obviously, clan house. The ceremonies opened with a song. The children all joined in. At one end of the room were 2 native women with rich Chilkat blankets thrown about their shoulders. They stood together, gracefully swinging their bodies side to side. They kept up the swinging for half an hour or more. After a while, the chief, Tka Hate, took the floor and proceeded to deliver what seemed to be a welcoming address. And at times during its delivery, half a dozen men would talk at the same time, probably telling of the glorious achievements of their chief. When the chief seemed to arrive at the closing part of his address, a half a dozen natives crowded their way into the room, loaded down with blankets, bolts of sheeting and calico, which they commenced to unwise and heap in endless confusion around their chief, until he was completely buried from sight under hundreds of yards of many-colored cloths. During the ceremony, some would exhort, a song would be sung, and again bolts of calico and sheeting were unwound and heaped upon Tka Hate. After which seemed to be hundreds of dollars worth of goods had been thrown about him, Tka Hate freed his arms, tearing off piece after piece, called out the names of whom he intended each grief. A number of men and women were kept busy distributing the goods. Blankets were given away, single and double, and valuable ones were cut in strips, and the small fragments passed out amongst the people. There were many of those who received special objects of regard by the chief, and those sometimes were buried under the many gifts, similarly to the way in which he was buried. Among the goods distributed were packages of ulican oil, pressed seaweed, dried salmon, halibut, hats, women's dresses, clocks, knives and forks, and every imaginable article of clothing, dry goods, and groceries. For 4 days and nights, this gifting proceeded. During the 4 days of celebration, not an angry word was heard. Sometimes Tlinkits disagree behind closed doors, you know. Nor was there any evidence of intoxication throughout that 4 days. Tka Hate clearly was a man of immense status and wealth produced by his prudent trusteeship of the Klawock River. Further, he clearly practiced the tenets of generosity and respect characteristic of a traditional Tlingit man, exercising his responsibilities towards his clanmen and others. Here is another picture of Tka Hate, more than likely in the regalia described from the 1890 potlatch. And so here we can see his Chilkat robe, his shakiat with ermine skins, abalone inlays, and sea lion whiskers. He's also holding a very, very large and impressive tina, the copper right here in front of him. John Rowan looked at this and said, the tina image that is on it is a mink, and that mink is the crest, of course, of the Klawock people. So Moser's heard from all of the leaders around the time about how the white people were blocking the streams. They were taking away the wealth. They were destroying people's foods, and they were exhausting the resource. The leaders said that they would soon face starvation. Moser concluded in his 1897 document that Indian rights to stream ownership should be recognized. What he learned about the circumstances at Klawock likely contributed to this conclusion. So this is what he found elsewhere, was white men downing trees and blocking the entire stream. A far cry from what a Tlingit would do in terms of managing their stream to ensure escapement. These are what were found throughout the southern area and many other areas. And he found that white men regularly ignored all the regulations of 1889 that had already been put in place. And so as the laws against the Tlingit traps called barricades were put in force, the population gradually shifted over to the drag seines and the purse seines, and their harvests got pushed away from the streams, and they went into other forms of independence, of independent fishing. And here in his late life is Tka Hate, pictured in casual garments, perhaps with a female relative. This could possibly be about 1903. Again, it comes from the John Brady collection. John Brady came back to Klawock at that particular time period. And when he came back, he came with a particular inquiry. And it was, again, Tka Hate, another opportunity to possibly exert leverage with regard to ownership. Brady had first met him, as I suggested, in 1882. In 1903, Brady sought out many Tlingit and Haida leaders who owned prominent kutia for donation to exhibit at international expositions. Tka Hate agreed to donate a pole he had commissioned and erected to honor his wife, who was Kagwantan. Governor Brady came to Klawock to make arrangements to acquire the pole. As Brady wrote to his wife in correspondence, Tka Hate called him Tom Tka Hate, came down to the boat to see Brady and to finalize the arrangements. On that particular occasion, Brady stated, Tka Hate asked for a deed showing his title to the river, stating his ownership. Brady wrote his wife that he had to delicately avoid answering the inquiry. The power equations had shifted dramatically between 1878 in terms of the ability of the Tlingit population to assert and gain leverage. Here is the pole that Tka Hate donated. There's a story behind it that you can read in a book called Most Striking of Objects, which only tells part of the story. That's quite interesting. And it appeared at two expositions before it returned to Alaska. Some of you may have been in the lobby of the Anchorage Museum for many years, and this is where a particular version of it was placed for many years. It's now no longer available to be seen. In addition, Tka Hate also had a grave marker where he was actually buried, and here we can see both, again, the raven whale motif associated with the mink crest on his graveyard marker. And Tka Hate's legacy is substantial. There's lineage of individuals that were raised by him. John Darrow was raised by him, where he learned those stories. In 1936, Theodore Roberts said Darrow came down to the Klawock River in extreme anger and took an axe to destroy a counting weir that was blocking the upward movement of huge numbers of salmon returning. No salmon would ever have been blocked in a Tlingit fish trap. Every tide, salmon could go up. And these counting weirs were blocking them. In the 1930s, numerous Tlingit individuals told me of the continuation of the salmon feast held on the estuary of the river, and roasted salmon fed to the people and the bones returned to the river. In 1938 or thereabouts, another man raised in Tka Hate's house, Robert Radevich, James Rowan, in addition to John Darrow. I believe he erected this particular monument. It sits on the same island quite near where the first cannery was built. On top is the crest and it indeed honors Tka Hate. Here in this particular image, we see Theodore Roberts holding forth and describing and discussing the history and significance of the relationship between the marker and the man who's named on that location. A new Tka Hate. In 2011, Alyssa Roberts gave the name to her grandson, Jim Roberts. They are pictured together holding the oldest picture of Tka Hate, which I had given to them by that particular time period. And there's the Tka Hate Memorial on Chuck Island in 2017. And in Tlingit practice, when going by shamans, traditional Tlingit would always leave, hopefully, tobacco to honor the spirit. So when you're on Prince of Wales Island and you're passing near the bridge, and you look up onto that island and you see that marker, you can remember that it was Tka Hate who stood up and expressed the power and claims of ownership of the Gunahuddy and started on a path that eventually was not taken. So thank you all very much for being here today and listening to my presentation. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. If anyone has any questions?
Go ahead, Dolores.
How were the Demmerts involved in the canneries?
The Demmerts had their own
When I
cannery.
went there in 1946, Radevich's owned one cannery and the Demmerts owned the other.
That's part of his legacy, is that ability to rise, to do things. The Demmerts came from the north. Okay, they came from the north and moved in probably either the late teens or the early 20s. They are not part of the original Tlawakwan or Robert Pradevich's Nas Tedi, and they moved in very early on and married with the Gunahuddies. So the Demmerts came later, and they had their own cannery, as you mentioned, which they built under the leadership of Charles Demmert. Robert Pradevich built his cannery under his own leadership, under that leadership. So as you might imagine in Tlingit life, they tended to be competitive against each other in those times and circumstances. So was there something else you wanted to know about that?
No, I just wondered how they got involved in the cannery business.
They, through the white father, Charles Demmert, the original white man, was a cannery man from a cannery in Port Beauclair up on the east side of Kuyu Island. And he had a son there named Charles Demmert. After that cannery was completed, the son moved to Chican, where he was working in that cannery. And when that cannery shut down in the late teens or around 1920, he was able to take buildings from that cannery and bring them down to Klawock, which is then where he established the cannery, and with his family, a very extensive and initially clan-based type of arrangement that subsequently had falling out over time period. So that's how those two individuals come there. But they do hold legacy to Tka Hate in the entrepreneurial and enterprising spirit to go forward and to confront and not stand back and not to be submissive in the face of these things. Yes.
Will you have these slides available?
Well, they'll be on this video.
The video?
The video will Chuck, it's on the video
There's a couple
site.
of slides I'd like to be able to reference or read again.
Yeah, you can, when you watch the video, you can click on the stop bar,
Okay.
and then you can see it.
All right, and my cousin Jim Roberts is here today.
He's here. Please stand up. Tka Hate is here. I didn't recognize him. Please come forward. Didn't recognize him. He's a real designer.
Any more questions? No? Well, thank you again very much. And please come back next week. Oh,
My friend.
I'd just like to make a quick comment. In addition to compliment you, Professor Langdon, I'd like to just say that in lieu of, I come from the Sakai House, Tuya Bay, and majority of the Salmon clans have similar stories as the presentation today. And what is most interesting is, in addition to the Salmon Boy story, we have a lot of history that has not been documented yet. And the migration story of our Tlingit people. In addition to the Salmon Boy, actually will lend credibility to the migration story. And it's really interesting the different species that the Tlingit knew, like the king salmon, the dog salmon, or chum salmon, or auk. The estuary speaks about when the salmon hits the fresh water. It gives more identification in the salmon that it stays in fresh water like 3 years as a fingerling before it goes out to sea. And the salmon story alludes to every aspect from the egg and turning into the small fingerlings before they go out to sea. And it talks about, the Salmon Boy story talks about survival in the feeding area in the Gulf and also the Bering Strait. They call it the donut hole. The Tlingit salmon story alludes to every aspect when the fingerlings go out to sea and then when they return. Ya dudagayati atwa adunahin katwukaku when the salmon hits the fresh water. Then the real identification of the various species lends itself, and that's the Tlingit aspect of identification, the type of salmon that they are, including the hooligans, smelt, and so forth. And historically, I just want to compliment Steve for bringing us to the point where the Klawock people up along the coast, actually, each story will lend more credibility of the visibility of different species. And it's based on the freshwater streams, the estuary as such, that in Teneke, there are 20 salmon streams in Teneke, including our salmon stream that we own at Kadashan Bay. Kadashan was named after my mother's first husband, Paul Kadashan. And it's historically, when I was a young boy, it was sold to me, and for a good reason, that I replaced my uncle, Charles Jack, And so they were grooming me. I didn't know when I was a young boy that they were grooming me about Kadashan Bay and the estuary that exists in Kadashan River. I just wanted to make a quick comment, and I'm overstepping my 1 minute. Thank you very much.
Just an announcement here, if you wanted to see the video again that he showed in the presentation, that's part of the exhibit downstairs on salmon traps and intertidal salmon traps, and there's more there. There's an excerpt of an interview he shot with Mr.
Theodore Roberts that you saw here about how those stone traps, you'll see stone traps. We use drone video image to get time lapse of the tide coming in completely over the traps and then receding out and where the fish would have been taken. And I'd like to acknowledge Debbie Head and her associates, assistants in making that possible. Thank you so much, Debbie, of the NAS TV class. Harold, you have an observation, please.
Something I didn't understand, where it showed that Tka Hate was speaking, and they spoke over him and wrapped him in something and buried him. I didn't understand that.
You didn't understand that?
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's a very Tlingit, I think it's a very traditional Tlingit practice for showing what? That's certainly what was done amongst Southern, by burying somebody in their wealth is the same as Shakes did it in a different way. He killed his slaves. By doing that, those activities do what? They demonstrate the wealth, the extraordinary wealth and the generosity of the person, because then he starts distributing all of that. And that's what all of his henchmen were, building him up. Here's, all those, well, I won't say anything more about the henchmen building somebody up. But that's what it was all about, this extraordinary process of making that statement to everybody who's there. This is my role as a Tlingit trustee. My ownership of the Klawock River, my engagement has produced this wealth. You are all the beneficiaries of my leadership. That's classic Tlingit leadership in terms of the way in which it was being recognized. At least that's my interpretation.
I agree. We don't talk about it a lot, but the blankets and calico replaced what we did to slaves.
Yeah, of course. And that, but remember, he merged everything, all those traditional products too. Everything was going out. Oolican, where was he getting oolican from? Where did he get oolican from? He could have got it from the north, but most likely he got it from what? The Semicircular, out of the Nass River. So it's all of these flows of a great leader pulling together all of these things, but for whose benefit? You guys know I'm great, but I'm helping you out. So it's that statement together. If you continue to support me, look what's going to flow. That's what that was all about in my. To me, that was the signal moment when I read that account. There is ultimate Tlingit expression of what a leader is all about and his relationship with the people that he has invited. So.
Tlingit also spoke about royalty, and royalty actually is demonstrated by the burial process. Like the shaman and the great leaders are never buried. And that's why the markers like totem poles and such that you mark is
showing the honor.
Exactly. Yeah. And I want to just make sure that I enforce these stories, the Tlingit stories that I'm capable of, to substantiate the existence of caste system. And caste system isn't really come to surface, but the Tlingit spoke of royalty. And thank you for your comments.
Thank you for bringing that out. I just wanted, to me, it's just, I just get so impressed, and I tell my friend over there, this is your standard here when you read about your ancestor. That's the man.
All righty, well, thank you again for coming.
Huh?